Hello, History 365. Today I'm going to be talking about the Hundred-Year War, a series of intermittent conflicts fought between England and France from 1337 to 1453. The outbreak of the war was sparked by a succession crisis in France. In 1328, Charles, the King of France, died without a son. His closest male relative was his nephew, Edward III, whose mother, Isabella, was Charles's sister. However, the French asserted that the royal line could not pass through a woman, and ultimately crowned Philip, the Count of Valois, as Philip VI. This might have ended matters, but the kings of France and England had long had an odd feudal arrangement, with the kings of England holding lands in France as vassals of the kings of France. Piqued that Edward had complicated his accession, Philip now deprived Edward of his holdings in Gascony. Edward III, who had struggled to free himself from his mother's control early in his reign, only asserted his claim to the throne in 1337, having first proven himself as a military leader in Scotland. It is quite likely that his goal was less to actually secure the throne of France than to obtain new holdings in France, although loot and glory were likely additional benefits. In 1346, Edward led an invading army that raided across northern France. A French force confronted him at Crécy, the first major battle of the war. Here, the charges of French cavalry were bested by the English longbow, unquestionably the defining weapon of the opening phases of the war. The English longbow might be more appropriately described as the Welsh longbow, a regional weapon encountered by English forces fighting against Welsh rebels, and then widely adopted. Its main benefit was that its exceptional length, as much as 6 feet, gave it exceptional power, even if the manufacture from yew wood was relatively simple. Now, the average archery bow has a draw strength of around 50 pounds. But a longbow has a draw strength of 80 to 100 pounds and could fire far faster than a crossbow. Now, one downside of the longbow is that it required substantial practice to develop the physical stamina to draw the bow and the eyes to range the arrows. Fortunately for the English, an archery culture had developed among the free peasants, the so-called yeomen, a practice that was encouraged by English kings from at least the time of Edward I. Now, the development of the longbow itself in Wales was likely a response to improvements in armor, especially increased usage of well-forged plate armor, which was more immune to arrows shot from shorter bows with lower draw strengths. Even so, the armor-piercing, bodkin-tipped arrows shot from a longbow might not be able to pierce the highest quality plate armor, but it still wreaked havoc on the combat tactics of French men-at-arms. Firstly, even as armor on horses increased during this period, a hail of arrows from a longbow could cripple and panic the horses of a knight, allowing longbowmen to dissipate cavalry charges, even if the knights themselves were protected by their plate armor and their shields. The threat of arrows to horses also prompted increased use of men-at-arms fighting on foot, where plate armor designed for cavalrymen might prove a significant burden for infantrymen. Finally, as John Keegan famously pointed out, English archers were of lower status, and French knights, while happy to be killed by the flower of English chivalry, may have disdained the prospect of being butchered by commoners, and this may explain, at least, the surrender or retreat of French cavalrymen at Agincourt. Now, after the victory at Crécy, the English captured Calais, which was going to be an English possession until 1558. But then both sides suffered from an unforeseen exogenous shock, the Black Death, caused by bubonic plague, which erupted in 1348 and may have killed off roughly a third of the total population of Europe. Even after the initial devastating outbreak, the Black Death re-emerged periodically, not only adding to the miseries of the war, but hindering both sides in their military mobilizations. Indeed, it was not until 1355 that Edward III launched a second major series of invasions of France, which culminated in 1356 in the Battle of Poitiers, where he confronted a French army personally commanded by King John II of France. Again, the efficacy of French knights was degraded by English longbowmen, and John himself was captured, leading a charge on foot. The king, a prisoner awaiting ransom, a peace treaty was signed, although John died in captivity. Nonetheless, a lull emerged, largely caused by dynastic problems. Edward III was less dynamic as he aged. His son, the energetic if brutal Black Prince, who had personally commanded at Poitiers, died young, and Edward III was ultimately succeeded by his 10-year-old grandson, Richard II, who proved, to say the least, a weak king. Both England and France faced peasant revolts, the Wat Tyler Revolt in 1381 in England, and a revolt in Ghent in 1385. Richard was overthrown in 1399 by Henry Bolingbroke, and dynastic strife continued as Bolingbroke, crowned Henry IV, confronted a serious rebellion led by Henry Hotspur Percy. The accession of Henry V in 1413 led to renewed hostilities. Now, Henry's own claim to the English throne was based on his father's usurpation. And yet Henry renewed his claim to the French throne. Here we see a prime example of war being mobilized to bolster flagging domestic legitimacy. Henry V's invasion of France in 1415 was a startling success. He captured the port of Harfleur with artillery, and then confronted a numerically superior French army at Agincourt. Using closed terrain to channel the opposing forces, his archers prompted the French cavalry to dismount, only to suffer extraordinary losses as they threw themselves against the English position. A French flying column briefly threatened the English camp, at which point Henry ordered the execution of prisoners. It is not clear the extent that this order was carried out. Ultimately, the crushing victory decimated the French aristocracy, killing roughly 6,000 knights, although in the near term it accomplished little, as Henry withdrew back to England. Nonetheless, further successful English campaigns led to the Treaty of Troyes, which declared Henry the regent of France and heir to the French throne. And then, when it looked like English victory might be total, Henry died in 1422. Leaving behind an infant son, Henry VI. The sudden, premature death of Henry V gave the French new hope and emboldened the disinherited Dauphin to proclaim himself king as Charles VII. Charles' attempts to relieve the siege of Orleans in 1428 found an unexpected boost when a teenage girl, Joan of Arc, approached French commanders claiming that she was ordained by God to lead the French to victory. Despite some skepticism, she was allowed to take part in operations around Orleans, where the French succeeded in lifting the English siege. Initially used as a mascot, Joan was increasingly included in high command decisions as the French counterattacked. Her presence sufficiently spooked the English and their Burgundian allies that she was captured and executed in 1431. By now, however, the war had shifted in favor of the French. The Burgundians made a separate peace with the French in 1435, returning the captured city of Paris. The French army also developed an increasingly effective artillery corps, capable of blasting the English out of various strongholds. If the longbow was the weapon that defined the first phase of the war, the cannon defined the last. The Battle of Castillon in 1453, 300 French guns blasted English assaults, almost the reverse of how English arrows had riddled the French knights at Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt. The war ended that year, with the English having lost all territory in France except for Calais. In a series of dispiriting campaigns fought largely over land and succession, amidst the backdrop of a devastating pandemic and a regional climate crisis, perhaps the biggest story of the Hundred Years' War was technological. The century plus saw the dramatic technological change in the deployment of artillery in Western Europe. At the beginning of the war, at Crécy, guns were crude objects, playing a decidedly supporting role to the longbow. By the war's end, cannons were decisive weapons, as both siege guns and as field artillery, and the development of the gun would ultimately change the entire trajectory of Eurasian warfare. And we will start to deal with that in future lectures. We'll all see you Friday. Have a good day.